All right. Well, let's get going here and we will continue to let folks in as they arrive. I'm going to hand it to Chair Brabazon to start us off here today. Thank you.
Thank you, and welcome everybody to this public information session. I want to begin by acknowledging that the Cawthat Regional District is located in the traditional territory of the Tla'amin, Shishel, Clahoose, Wamalco, and Comox First Nations. QRD has secured provincial grant funding through the Union of BC Municipalities Community Emergency Preparedness Fund to complete a regional coastal flood adaptation strategy, and has partnered with the Tla'amin Nation and the City of Powell River to work together on developing a regional coastal flood adaptation strategy. We have contracted Ebwater Consulting and Shift Collaborative to help lead us through the important work of learning more about coastal flood and erosion risk along our shoreline, and developing a strategy to make our communities more resilient to rising sea levels. And with that, I'll turn it over to the experts.
Thanks so much. I should hand it over to Tamsin, I suppose, with that introduction, but I'll take it for the moment. Good evening, everyone. My name is Erica Crawford, and I'm with Shift Collaborative. I'm part of the consulting team who are working on this project for the Regional Coastal Flood Adaptation Strategy. And we are working with the 3 partner governments in the region, and wonderful folks to be working with. And want to welcome you to this session. This is the beginning of some engagement that we will be doing over the next few months to inform the strategy as it's being developed. And we're going to tonight walk through a little bit of background and get into some conversation with you and hear a bit from you as well. So Rob, could you share the slides, please? All right, so moving ahead, a couple of slides here. Great. So as I mentioned, today we're going to touch on this project, where it's coming from, where it's going, and also provide you with a little bit of background and introduction to coastal flood and erosion risk in general, how we approach that, some of the ways that we think about that. And then also we'll do an overview looking more specifically at the region. And so there's various pieces of work that have been done leading up to this point. And so we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like for the Cawthat region specifically. And then, as I mentioned, we're going to do some live polling this evening, as well as some small group discussion, because we'd love to hear directly from you and start to understand a little bit more about what's important to you that might be impacted by these issues. Next slide, please.
Oh, sorry, wrong way. There you go.
With that, I'll excuse everyone's technical difficulties tonight, so don't worry, it happens to everyone. So we're going to start here with a little bit of getting to know you next, and then we will head into some presentation, and we'll be doing the live polling throughout the evening. So when we do start that up, you can just leave that open on your computer or on your phone. I'll explain that all in just a moment. And so we'll start with one presentation, do a bit of the live polling again, and then a second part of the presentation. And these pieces are going to give you a little bit of background, so that when we get to the small group discussion, we can really jump in and hear from you what really matters to you and what your ideas are for the future. And then we'll come back together at the end and let you know about some other things coming up over the next few weeks and the next couple of months, where you can continue to get involved and learn more and share more about what matters to you. Next slide, please. So just a really quick review of some of the functions with Zoom. So at the lower left there, you can turn your microphone on and off. While we're in this big group together, for the most part, you can just leave those off. And if you want to share your video, you're welcome at any point. It's always lovely to see who's here with us. And that's where you can control those. When we do go into the small groups, then we'd really encourage you, if your bandwidth allows, to share your video, and you can go to the top right-hand corner to choose gallery view so that you can have a little bit of a sense of being in a group together, even though we're in this virtual space together. And then at the bottom, key one is the chat box. So we'll be sharing things with you in the chat throughout the evening, and also feel free to leave comments, ask questions, share resources or ideas that you have with others who are here using that chat. Next slide, please. All right, so this is what I was mentioning, the live polling. Some of you may have experienced something like this before. For those who are new, it's quite simple, and hopefully one of these methods will work to help you to connect easily. So there's a few ways that you can connect to this. And once you get to this page in your browser window or on your phone, then there will be some questions that will begin to pop up, and you can just provide your answers. And so we'll see in real time what people are answering and be able to get a little bit of a feel for who's here. So I've just put a link in the chat. So the easiest way really, if you're on a computer, is just to click on that link that just came up in the chat, and that will take you to the page. If you have a phone handy, you can also just point your camera at this QR code, and it will give you the option to open this page. It's called menti.com. And so that's another way, or you can manually do that. So go to menti.com and then enter the number that you see on the screen here. So 65152467. So we will switch over to the Menti deck here, and I will let you know what the questions are as we begin to pull them up.
So I'll stop sharing, Erica.
Yes,
We'll pull up the other
please.
one.
All right. So what should be on your screen here is something that says opening, and we're going to advance the slide here to the first question. Love to get a sense of where people are coming from tonight. So what part of the region do you currently live in? And we've got this broken down by Tla'amin Nation lands, the regional district electoral areas, and the city of Powell River. And if you're joining from somewhere else, you can also just write that in the chat so that we know where you're coming from. And if anyone is having any troubles connecting to this also, please just let us know in the chat, or you're also welcome to unmute if we can help direct you to get here as well. Aha, okay, great. Thanks, Andrew. Yes, we don't have electoral area E on here because it's, yeah, great. Okay, good. I think it's not covered by the project. Am I right with that? So that's good to know. We've got a couple folks coming from the city. Great. So most folks coming from the city of Powell River. Perhaps this is a little influenced as well by where people can connect with the internet, and also someone coming from Savory Island. Wonderful. And someone who has property in Stillwater. Great. Fantastic. All right. So going on to the next question here. So we're going to be talking about the impacts along the coast. And we're just curious how many of you do live right along the coast, so within 100 meters of the shoreline. Okay, so a few folks who live right along the coast and a few who are not right on the coast, but couldn't be too far away. Fantastic. All right. And the next question. One of the things we're going to be talking about today is with flood and erosion risk that happens and will happen along the coast. What we're really interested in is the ways that that impacts the things that matter to us. So we're beginning here with a question of what do you value about living in a coastal community? Interested to find out about values, because that will inform the risk assessment, and you'll hear more about that as we start up here in just a moment. The sea, the weather, the view of the water. that proximity, nature and environment. Yeah, the climate and weather again, always changing. Views, environment, yes. So seeing a few patterns there. Nature, the beautiful area that you live in, the location right on the sea, and how that changes as well. Great. All right. And the next question, and this is the last one for this round. So one of the things that we'll also be talking about is this idea of resilience. And so as we face changes due to climate, what can we do to become a more resilient region? And so we're asking you here, what do you think actually makes a region resilient? So a couple of people talking about knowledge, having a plan for the future, being able to look forward and adapt. Community itself and cooperation, the connectedness between us, sharing, openness, definitely a big factor in resilience. Redundancy, learning how to protect, changing our ways. Yes, so again, seeing a few patterns emerging there with similar ideas about what makes for a resilient region. Wonderful. All right, so good to get a feel for all of you early on here. And we're going to move into some information about the project. So I'm going to hand this over to Rob to take us from here and begin to give you a little bit of information about how this project came to be and where we're going from here. And then we will get into the topic of tonight, coastal risk.
Great, thanks, Erica. Yeah, so I'm going to give a really brief update on the project. So yeah, I guess my name is Rob. I'm the project manager for the Ebwater team. So to put it really succinctly, the project goal is to engage with the public in exploring adaptation options. I just want to take you back to 2018, which is a good starting point for this project when we're thinking about the previous work and where we're at today and where we want to go. So back in 2018, Tetra Tech started some high-level coastal flood and erosion mapping and data analysis. And they also did an overview coastal risk assessment. And that work helped them and the regional district to prioritize areas that should be looked at in more detail. So following that work, some more detailed flood and erosion mapping was completed. And so that was done both for the mainland areas and some areas on the islands. And that was just recently completed back in, well, last month. And then this project is aimed at using that data and information and building on it to work on an adaptation strategy so that we can, look to mitigate those areas that are at risk. So we're doing that as well as obtaining input on values and the things that matter to people. So that's where the public comes in. And then we'll be looking at the implementation of those options as part of a future project. So that's sort of the big picture in a nutshell. Back to you, Erica.
All right, and as I mentioned, we're in the process of a series of engagement events that will happen over the next couple of weeks, and then another one a bit later in June. So this is the first session. It's meant to share some information about the project and start to get a sense of some of these things from you. And then there's a deeper dive through a survey. And so we'll share that link with you later in the session and would really appreciate if folks were willing to take a few minutes. It 10, 15 minutes to fill out this survey. And that will help us very much in understanding what's important to you and what some of your priorities and preferences are as we start to craft what the possible strategies could be. Also later in this month, on April 27th, another Wednesday evening, we're going to have an online game night. It's called the Flood Resilience Challenge, and it's both a very fun way to learn and sort of talk about flood resilience, and also it's one of the most powerful and insightful things that we do with people. It's a really incredible way to really understand the complexity, the different perspectives, and how we can start to put these different pieces together as a community to build our resilience. So really encourage you to join that if you are available, and also invite others and encourage them to come as well. And then we'll be doing some work in the background for a little bit, and then we'll come back at the end of June with a workshop and open house. And we hope that you'll join us. COVID willing, it will be at Willingdon Park in person. And that will be an opportunity to see some of the proposed strategies that we have and get more feedback from you at that point about your thoughts and how do we make some decisions between the different options. So that's what's coming up. And so the next part, we're going to pass it over to Tamsin Lyle, who is the principal at Upwater Consulting, and she's going to walk us through some the basics of flood and erosion on the coast. Tamsin.
Yeah, good evening, everybody. So as Erica said, my name's Tamsin, and I am the principal at Upwater. We're based down here in Vancouver on the unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. But I'm excited to be working with you on your coastline. And what I'm just going to run through now is some of the things that we have to think about, some of the details and the sort of the messy space to understand how the ocean interacts with the coastline and then interacts with the things that we care about on the coastline. Next slide, Rob. So you all live on the coast. We just learned that, and many of you live within 100 meters of the coast. So a lot of this is old information. You totally understand this. But one thing we want to just highlight is that water levels in the ocean, when they come up, are made up of all sorts of different things. Some of them are very understandable and predictable. So we call the tide deterministic because we know when it's going to happen. And there's other things that are probabilistic in that we understand a little bit about the statistical probability that they might turn up, but we don't know when they're going to turn up. So there's a lot of uncertainty around that. And these things all together pile up to create the water level. And so at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter why things are high water, why we have high water. It matters that there is high water. And there's especially matters in areas where we have soft soils along the coastline, because these waves and the wind and the high water levels can create a lot of erosion, which we know is a challenge in that regional district. Rob? So one thing that we want to highlight, and it's something that we need to use as we go forward and make decisions, is the difference or the recognition that there's a wide variety of different types of storms that approach the coast. There are storms that you see, every winter 3 or 4 times. There are storms that you might remember in your past that is in your real memory as something that you've seen, and then there might be really large storms that haven't occurred yet or that have occurred on in the very long record of what's happened. So we need to be aware that there are small storms as well as large storms, because Rob's going to flick the slide for me. There's a need to understand that because the smaller storms are occurring more frequently, they can actually be very damaging because they're hitting the same areas over and over again. And cumulatively, you can create more damage from some of these smaller storms than the really big storms. So it's important to recognize that there is a range of storms that are experienced along the coast, and that we need to consider all of them when we're making decisions. And so that's my next slide, I think. I've already said it. Key message here is that there's a lot of nuance in flood hazard. They're not just there or not there. There's a lot more nuance in them. And so it's really important to consider this when we make decisions about what we want to do to adapt to coastal erosion and flood events and sea level rise. Next slide, which is when I dive into sea level rise. So all of you are here tonight. And you will have seen the IPCC report, presumably in the news in the last couple of weeks, telling us about climate change and that one of the main outcomes of climate change is sea level rise. And it's certainly something that we're seeing around the world. And basically it's a combination of melting ice water as well as the expansion of the water as it warms up, just like you learned about in grade 4 or 5 or something. As you heat water, it expands. And so it is increasing water levels around the world, and that translates locally in different ways. The other thing that happens here is that we have subsidence or uplift of time. So what we're worried about is really the relative sea level rise, because if sea level is rising, but your land is also rising, then the relative difference is smaller. Next slide, please. So one of the huge challenges we face when we're planning for sea level rise is the fact that we don't have any certainty in what it's going to look like 20 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, because there's so much uncertainty baked into the projections. So we have to start by understanding our human behavior. What are we going to do as a global population in terms of our emissions going forward? Then we have to understand how those emissions translate into global sea level rise. And then beyond that, we have to understand how that imprints on our local landscapes. And they're different. There's a lot of variation in that. So for example, out here on the west coast of Canada, our relative sea level rise rates are about half or more than half the size of what's happening on the east coast. And that is a large part just due to ocean currents and the warming of the ocean areas. So what I want to highlight here is that in the Cathette Regional District, the current latest projections that just came out recently from Environment Canada show that the relative sea level rise could be anywhere between -10 centimeters through to 60 centimeters. So there's a lot of variation in there. And then there's a worst case scenario you see at the top, which is the 1 meter of sea level rise, which assumes the Western Antarctic ice sheet failure. But the takeaway, if we go to the next slide, Rob, is that we're dealing with a lot of uncertainty. So we know it's rising globally, at least, and we know it's rising a little bit around here, but we don't know what rate that is and when we're going to get to different levels of sea level rise. So we really have to sort of embrace that uncertainty and make sure that whatever solutions that we are proposing are adaptable to future conditions, whether that's more sea level rise or less sea level rise. Next slide, please. And one of the other key elements that we use to inform our decisions is this idea of risk. So I'm using risk in a very specific sort of technical way here to describe the intersection of the hazard, in this case, the water, and the bad thing with the elements that we care about on the floodplain. And we can think about this using this risk triangle, which is a global facility for disaster risk reduction concept, where you have the area inside the triangle equal to your risk. One side is the hazard, the bad thing. One side is the exposure. That's the 2D space. So what are all the things that we care about that are in the floodplain? And the third vertex is the vulnerability or susceptibility of those elements getting wet. So for example, park infrastructure, like a bench or something, is pretty sort of robust and is not going to get damaged in a flood event. Whereas a substation, electrical substation, if it gets wet, is going to be very vulnerable or susceptible to damage. And if we think about this risk triangle, that's what we want to focus on, is making sure that we're keeping that one size, not increasing it, and ideally reducing it. And we can do that by sometimes collapsing an entire vertex. Next slide, Rob. However, I just presented this super simple model of risk, but of course it's not that simple. It's much more complex, because inside that triangle are all the things that we care about and all of the environment and the culture as well. So we need to recognize that there are many different things in the floodplain that are affected in different ways. And up here, I've got just 6 global groupings that are used globally to describe for disasters, what are the things that we need to think about in a sort of structured way to make sure that we don't forget anything. So people, obviously, the environment, financial issues, as well as culture, and disruption of critical infrastructure. Next slide. And another important concept that we're going to get you to think about a little bit later is the idea of direct impacts versus indirect impacts. And so when we think about direct impacts of flood, those are things that are actually getting wet during a flood event, whether that's a house or a highway or a ferry terminal. And the indirect impacts are everything that happens in a different time or a different space away from that water. So for example, if the ferry terminal gets wet, that means that there's a disruption across the whole of the Cathett regional district, and you may not be able to access other places. Or if you lose the power, you're going to have other problems that are much more widespread. And I think everybody's experienced this in the last few months. So when in November, we had the flood event in the valley here, and we lost the railway and the roads and all of our connections to the rest of the country, we had those supply chain issues. And so those are what we call the indirect or cascading impacts. So key message here is that risk is what really matters. It doesn't really matter that there's water there, but it matters that it's interacting in a negative way with something that we care about. And our third action in response to this is that we should use risk as the basis to make decisions, but acknowledge that it's a very messy and complex space. So we need to be aware of that when we're making choices about how we're going to adapt. Next slide. Oh, right, I got it. So just in summary, this is a really intractable and messy problem. And this is only when we're thinking about flood. And beyond that, there are all of the other things that we care about, other types of hazards, our general community experience. And so we need to be aware of that when we're trying to find a solution, and consider all of the nuances and not assume that there's a single solution because it's a simple problem. And I think that's it for me. Thanks. Do we want to do questions now, Erica?
Yeah, we could just pause here. Is there anything, if you have any questions for Tamsin about what she's shared so far, or if you have any questions generally about the project and what's happening here, you're welcome to raise your hand. If you click on the reactions button down below, it'll give you the option to raise your hand. So you're welcome to do that, and we can come around to hear from anyone who might have anything to ask at this point. You're also welcome throughout the session to put questions in the chat, and we'll also pause at a couple other points and would be happy to hear from you then as well. Not seeing anything just now. So let's go to the Menti poll again. And if anyone has a question, once we're finished that, please do raise your hand and we'll come back around to you. So again, you may still have this open on your web browser. If so, just go back to that browser and it'll take you to the next question when we advance it here. If not, the link is in the chat again, so you can just click on that to get to the Menti poll. And we've got a couple more questions here for you. So we'll switch over to the Menti poll. And the first question that we have is to find out a little bit about how important this is. So how concerned are you about the things that we're talking about today? We're talking about climate change, we're talking about the impacts in terms of flood, and also the impacts in terms of erosion risk along the coast. So just pull that slider, it goes from not at all to extremely, and let us know how concerned you are about these various aspects of what we're talking about here today. And if anyone is having trouble, I know some folks are actually getting onto the Menti site, you're also welcome to enter your answers into the chat at any point. It would be wonderful still to hear from you that way. All right, great. So we've got folks that are pretty concerned about climate change and erosion a little bit more than the flood. So that's great to see where you guys are starting from here. And of course, folks who have showed up are probably relatively concerned to begin with. So good to see that. The next question that we have here, what would you say is your level of knowledge of sea level rise and coastal impacts? Is this new to you? Is this something that you've read a lot about or have experience with in other ways? So from very high down to very low, or if you're not really sure, you can just say, I don't know as well. So a range of starting points here from folks who've joined today. That's great to see. And and all of you have direct experience of living with these kinds of hazards on the coast, regardless of any other knowledge you might have about it. So looking forward to hearing more about that. So the next question, speaking of, are you aware of any changes that you've been seeing happening due to sea level rise or flooding or erosion along the coastlines? Just curious if these are things you're seeing happen already, things you're anticipating, things you're just curious about. Great, so most people are seeing some things happening already. So that's very interesting. We'd love to hear more about that. And the next question asks you just that. So what have you noticed? So just some short answers. We're going to talk more about this when we go into the small groups, but just curious, what's the thing that stands out to you? What do you notice? What have you noticed in terms of those impacts along the coast already, so we can get a sense of that? And in the next piece here, Rob's going to speak to us a little bit more about what some of the risks look like, given some of the data that has been put together, the maps that have been made, and so on. So we'd like to start by hearing from you about what you've noticed. Just give folks a minute, as you might be typing. Yeah, okay. So yeah, erosion, clearly erosion, there's a number of different places being named here is a big concern, and slides as well. Beaches are changing. Yeah, seeing that the waves are higher. We saw that here too, a bit north of where you guys are. Very high tides recently. Travel route getting detoured. Yeah, noticing the location of roads and buildings in relation to this and how that interacts with these things. Fantastic. Okay, great. Great. Looking forward to hearing more. And for now, we're going to turn to Rob, who is going to share with us about some of what we've been putting together about this region in particular.
Excellent, thanks, Erica. Yeah, let's dive into it. So yeah, we're gonna look at these coastal flood and erosion issues in the project area. So you all know the Kathet Regional District has quite a large shoreline. I mentioned before that some of the previous work that Tetra Tech did prioritized some areas. Those are shown in the circles on this map. So they had identified about 13 areas which we considered as candidate areas. And then we really wanted to narrow that list down. We did so to about 5 focus areas, we're calling them, to really look at the things that are important that we can then use to consider and progress discussions around adaptation, but for the whole shoreline. So we were looking at specific things in certain areas that we could really apply to the whole shoreline. So quite a challenge to do this. So in that vein, I want to remind you, or I'm going to show you some focus areas, but please keep in mind these are to be looked at in terms of illustrative only. And think about how this group of 5 focus areas, they encompass a range of representative characteristics, again, for the whole coast. So they encompass QRD areas A, B, and C, as well as Plum and Nation lands and the city of Powell River. One of our focus areas is on an island. Some are more rural, some are more urban. And then they also have a variety of flood and erosion hazards, as well as a variety of exposed elements. Now, I forgot to mention that, so the 5 focus areas, I'm going to go through them. They're shown in with the yellow dots here in this map. So we're going to dive in, starting with the Lund focus area at the northern area of the QRD. So this area is interesting for a number of reasons, but the first thing I want to bring your attention to are the flood layers that we're showing. So There's both a small frequent flood that's shown here with the blue diagonal lines and the sort of the darker blue outline. And then you can see the larger infrequent flood is shown by the pale blue, and it obviously encroaches more onto the land. But you can see that even things that are affected by the small flood include things like the resort and the shops, as well as some important wastewater outfall infrastructure. So there's obviously the outfall going out into the Georgia Strait there in the middle left of the image, as well as the lift station right where the outfall is near land. So that would be pretty critical if that were to fail. There's also several docks that are flooded, are exposed to the small flood. And so we've got that ferry going to Savory Island, as well as other docks and a helipad. So important to consider for emergency transport. Now, as Tamsin mentioned before, we can categorize some of these impacts in terms of indicators. So I'm just showing some here. So some that I've mentioned in the previous slide, but there's a couple extra ones in terms of people, economy, critical infrastructure, and culture. So just one other thing to mention in terms of recreational value, it is the gateway to Desolation Sound. So there's quite a bit of movement there. So an important harbor. Moving to the next focus area is Savory Island. One of the unique things about this island or this area is that it's got a highly erodible shoreline, and it's quite steep. There's a critical environmental ecosystem, sand dune ecosystem, and obviously there's quite limited space on the island. So obviously a lot of these address points that we have here are not vacant, they're vacant. But still goes to show that there's very little space when we're thinking about adaptation strategies in terms of relocating or retreating to other areas. And again, we've got a list of impacts, and these are some of the important ones, but there are more. Another thing to note here in terms of the environmental indicator is that all of these homes are on septic systems, and which are an important contamination source if they were to flood. Moving south, just showing the Shoshone area here. One thing we've added to this map is the coastal hazard area that was mapped as part of the 2010 land use plan. So it's shown with the black diagonal lines. A couple of the things that are in the flood zone here, there's the community septic system and the treatment plant system. They're shown by the two pink dots there. There's also quite a few homes that are leasehold residential, and the properties are exposed to the large flood. A couple other things to mention with this area in terms of the environment, there's the Slammin Estuary, and the fish hatchery is within the large flood zone. And in terms of recreation, there's the recreational sea walk. And there's also a few archaeological sites. And I have to say that this applies everywhere. All of the focus areas that we're looking at have archaeological sites, and they're quite prevalent along the QRD shoreline. And then this is Grief Point in Powell River. So it's more of an urban area. You can see the large flood extent actually encroaches quite a bit inland there, affecting sort of the second row of houses. So there's quite a few people that are exposed to that larger flood. The area is also critical habitat for blue herons. And going back to the flooded area, there's a number of utilities such as water infrastructure, telecommunications, energy, or more specifically gas lines, and roads that are affected by the flood. I'll skip over this slide and go on to our last focus area, which is Stagger Road. And so this is an area that's actually 3.5 kilometers long, and it's a high erosion potential area as well, with steeper slopes. There are a few homes and therefore people that are directly exposed to the large flood, but perhaps a bigger risk are some of the homes that are higher up on the hill and that are exposed to erosion hazard. And I think, yeah, important to remember that in these rural areas, there's a lot of septic systems that are susceptible to contaminating floodwaters. Okay, over to you, Tamsin.
Yes. So Rob's just brought us through the 5 focus areas, which sort of give us an opportunity to understand a diversity of conditions across the Cathet Regional District that can then be, when we look into solutions, we can maybe apply those more broadly across the whole region. But I also want to remind everybody to think a little bit when you have your discussions in a minute about connecting all of these things together and connecting Cathet to the rest of the world. So there's all of those indirect impacts that are really important to consider. And the other thing I wanted to just bring your attention to when we're talking about sea level rise and erosion and all of these issues is the sort of the relative golden spot that you folks are in terms of the expected projections for sea level rise. So when you're watching other solutions in the media or stories from like the East Coast of the US where large towns are falling into the ocean, keep in mind that that's not what's happening here, and that the solutions therefore need to be focused on what makes sense for your region in particular. So those solutions, I'm going to jump right in and give you a little bit of an overview of how we structure and think about some of the options that are available to us. And I'm hoping everybody remembers our risk triangle from about 15 minutes ago. So when we're thinking about adaptation strategies for the coast, we use what's called a PARAR framework, P-A-R-A-R, and we'll go through those letters one by one. So the first one is protect strategies. So when we're thinking about the triangle, that's sort of all about managing the hazard side of that triangle. And we can do that through the structures that people understand, I think, which are the dikes and the seawall. So the idea there is that you're trying to stop the water. But there's actually a larger toolbox within the protect adaptation strategy that is all about sort of taking the edge off the energy that's coming in. So you might not be able to stop the height of water, but you are able to reduce the wave energy by using natural materials, recognizing that that all of the the seagrass and all of these things that we can have out in front of homes and other assets can actually really reduce the wave energy and therefore reduce the hazard. So our next strategy is the adapt strategy. Oh no, it's avoid strategy. And so this is really, when we think back to our triangle, is about kind of holding the line and not increasing our exposure. So making sure that when we're thinking about development, either as a government, but also as an individual, that you're not going to increase your risk by making a decision to put your home or some other thing that you care about in an area that we know that has a hazard. So it's really about sort of preventing increasing our risk into the future. So then we get to R, which is the retreat. And this is sometimes feels a bit heavy because it feels like you're giving up and you're stepping back. But actually, it's a very important tool in our toolbox, especially when we think about it more as managed retreat, as something that we're very thoughtful about how we're going to do over time. It's not wholesale pick up and move. It's slowly moving over time to manage the fact that the sea level is rising and the coast is eroding, to make sure that there isn't a catastrophic failure. And there are examples of this happening all around the world, absolutely, and across British Columbia. So Grand Forks right now, you may have been seeing it in the news, has currently taking down some of the homes that were damaged in the 2018 flood and retreating from some areas to allow the river to have more room. So that has advantages hydraulically in terms of the hazard, but it also very importantly collapses that triangle because you remove the exposure of elements that you care about from the hazard area. So next A, here's accommodate. So accommodate is all about learning to sort of live with the water, understanding that there are areas that will get wet, and making sure that the decisions that we make or the buildings that we build allow for the building to be wet on occasion, either by protecting the buildings with an envelope or allowing water to come in and recovering more quickly afterwards. This is kind of a new strategy across Canada. It's very widely applied in places like Australia and the UK and all over Europe, where they have less room to move. But there's a whole amazing toolbox of things that individuals, the whole of society, every individual can do to support their own risk reduction through these kind of strategies. And our last strategy, the final R, is about resilience. So the previous 4 strategies I spoke about were all about that risk triangle and reducing our risk. And resilience strategies are those that really focus on what happens after the shock event, after the flood, after the earthquake, to ensure that communities recover quickly. So it's about creating public education materials to ensure that people know what to do in these events, by creating community events so that you understand who's in your neighborhood, who's going to need the most help after an event, for example. There's a lot of really simple tools that are available to us that will increase resilience after a flood event, but also have the bonus of creating resilience across all different types of hazards, but also just generally increasing community happiness. And that's it for me. I'm handing it over to Erica.
Great, thanks, Tamsin. So we're going to move into small group discussions, and this is a chance to dig into some of these big topics that we've started to introduce here and talk more about those focus areas as well, or other parts of the region that you're interested in and concerned about in relation to coastal flood and erosion. So on the next slide, please. Tamsin Lyle will be available as well. So if you have questions, you can just let your facilitator know in your group, and she'll be available to pop in and answer those questions if you do have something you want to follow up on. We're going to go into some breakout groups now. There's going to be, I think it's going to be a bit smaller than this, maybe around 5 or 6 people in each group. And you will have one of us as a facilitator in each of those groups, myself, Rob, who you've heard from, and Deanna, who you can see as well. And we'll be taking notes in something called Mural, which is an online version of flip charts and sticky notes that we used to do when we were in person, and hopefully will one day again, perhaps in June. And when you're in these groups, there will also be a timer that you can see at the top of your of the Zoom window, and it will tell you how much time we have left. We're going to take about 25 minutes in these groups, and so you can kind of have a sense of how much time is there. And we really just invite you to be aware also, if we can go to the next slide, of who is in your room, in the room with you, and making space so that everyone has a chance to share. So the piece here about step up and step back, if you're someone who hangs back, please do bring your voice forward. We'll give everyone a chance. We'll go around in the first round to make sure that we can hear from everyone. If you know that you're someone who tends to talk a little bit more, maybe be aware to hold yourself back a little bit to make room for others. And then once we've heard from everyone, then there could be a bit more space for folks to just chat more openly and freely. So just being aware that way, being a good neighbor in your breakout group. And in relation to that, really listening with an open mind and open heart, being willing and perhaps wanting to be surprised in a good way today by some of the things that you hear from others who have come with their concerns as well, and bringing this approach of, if you find that you're starting to make assumptions or judgments about someone, turning that into a question and trying, really seeking to understand where someone is coming from. And so really bringing that openness and our shared humanity to the conversation, and also be present. So if there's things that you can turn off to not be as distracted, that can help. And also turning on your video so that we can all see one another and have that sense of being in a room together. One note is that we are recording the session tonight because we want this information to be available to others through the website. However, we won't be recording the breakout groups themselves, so you don't have to worry about anything that you say there going anywhere beyond this space. So in that group, we will start with a quick round of introductions, and then we've got a couple of key questions here for you. So we'll spend some time first. As I mentioned, we'd really love to hear a little bit more from you about what kinds of impacts that you've noticed and what you're concerned about going forward in terms of coastal flood and erosion, and thinking about those 5 focus areas that Rob introduced to you. And if there's one of those that you'd like to speak a bit to, we'd really love to hear more of your thoughts and insights about what you've seen and what you anticipate and are concerned about. And then the second part of the conversation is thinking towards the future. And so one of the questions is, if you think forward a couple of generations, what are the important things about your community and about the shoreline, the things that you value about this place that you really want to make sure that you're leaving for future generations? So that's one part of the question. And then also, what kind of actions do you feel would be most effective for addressing the impacts that you're seeing? So those 2 are the more hypothetical looking forward questions. So does anyone have any questions before we split into these groups? You'll also have a facilitator so they can help you if there's anything particular that you want some clarification on. But everyone clear enough on where we're going here? All right, fantastic. Okay, so we're going to go into our groups. We'll see you back here in about 25 minutes. Have a good conversation. Hi, everyone. Apologies to those who got cut off there. Thank you so much. Sorry about that. Keith, you're right, just finishing your thought there, but hope folks had a good chance to share and hear from one another in the time that we had. We had a great conversation, and it was really lovely to hear from folks. We had a few people who were directly impacted, living right along the shoreline themselves, and then others with a variety of concerns coming from different perspectives as well. So hope that everyone had a good conversation. And we're going to do one last mentee poll here as a way of kind of gathering together some of the takeaways from your conversations. And then if we have any time after that, maybe I'll invite some comments if there's anyone who would like to speak. But so I will just share that link once more if I can find it here. There it is. Hopefully you've got it open still, but if you don't, there's the link again. And Deanna, if you could share the mentee screen again, and we'll just ask you a couple questions by way of sort of gathering together some thoughts here. So you had a chance in your group to hopefully talk about and hear about a whole range of different impacts that people are concerned about. If you were to choose 3, obviously they're all important, but if you were to choose the 3 that you're feeling most concerned about right now, what would those be? So as we heard from Tamsin earlier, impacts to people, to homes and buildings, economic, cultural, ecological impacts to infrastructure, and then also the indirect impacts, thinking about supply chains and ferries and transportation routes and all of these types of things. All right, so hearing from a few folks here, infrastructure being a key concern from almost everyone, as well as impacts to homes and buildings and ecological impacts, and then a few others concerned about the human health and social impacts, cultural impacts, and other indirect impacts as well. Okay, so the next question We're also talking in our groups about the kinds of actions that that you'd prefer, things that you think would be more effective for addressing the kind of impacts you were discussing. So just a quick poll here as well. What types of actions are you feeling would be most effective? And again, you can choose up to 3 here. And when we're thinking about this, we think about it as a suite of tools that we will use. So of course, there's not one thing that's going to deal with such a complex problem in so many different areas. There's going to be lots of different things that we need to do. So, but we can't do everything. So we're looking for what direction would you point us in? What do you think is going to be the most effective thing? Where should we start? All right, so seeing a few people choosing education and awareness, that definitely came up in our group as well as being key to the same context that we're starting from when we have many people making decisions. Regulations and controls, so mandatory regulations and controls. We definitely heard some things about the troubles of individual choices and how they don't add up to the ideal outcome sometimes. So that's important. Maintaining natural spaces, and collaboration and dialogue in the region are the other ones that are coming up strongly here too. Fantastic, thank you. All right, and one other question that we asked you also was really thinking forward and thinking about future generations and what it is that we want to be leaving to them in these precious places that we live and are spending our lives. So what is one thing that you feel is most important to ensure that we preserve or enhance for future generations? Give folks a moment. This is another one where you have to type in, so I'll just take a minute here. Natural shorelines and intertidal areas, the shoreline access, education, commitment to take the climate crisis and its impacts seriously, the knowledge that we have to protect our beautiful land. Yeah. Educate people on effective ways to deal with climate change. That's great. Yeah. All right. Thank you very much for sharing those thoughts and for your time this evening to gather together to talk about this important issue. And great, there's still a couple more coming in here. Maintaining options and again, education and knowledge. It's fantastic. Great. Okay, thanks, Deanna. So thank you everyone for that. And we do have a couple minutes here. And so I'm curious if there's anyone from your conversations, if there's something that stands out to you that you might want to share for the benefit of the whole group here that came up in your conversation, something you're concerned about, what you think about the actions we should be taking or anything that's sitting with you from your conversation. If no one's stepping forward, I wonder if Rob or Deanna, if there's anything from your groups that you might want to share back here.
Yeah, I can step in, but yeah, I think what we heard in our group was pretty consistent with what we just saw in the poll. So a lot of people thinking about regulations, the need for a coordinated approach through regulations, and then also that educational piece being really key to that. Yeah, just kind of getting that collaboration going.
Great.
In my group,
yeah, go ahead, Deanna.
We talked a lot about noticing erosion, especially in places that haven't been eroding previously. So yeah, erosion was a big concern. And in terms of future values, beautiful natural places and wanting the future generations to also enjoy those. And for most effective actions, education was one of them. natural options like green shores instead of just seawalls, and also discouraging new development in risky zones.
Great. Sounds like really wide-ranging conversation here too. Great. So I think we've got the beginnings of some themes happening here. As we go forward, we're going to be taking a few more steps. And so maybe Rob, you could share the slides again, and I'll just speak to what those are going forward here. So as I mentioned before, there's a few things that are going to be coming up, and we'd really love for you to come back and join us for these as well. We'll be building successively from one piece to the next, and so it would be really fantastic now that you've got this background if you'd be willing to come back again. The thing that's coming up right now and is now available on the website, on the Cathet Regional District website, is the survey. So that's really building off of what we have talked about here today. And Deanna, if you could share the backgrounder and the link in the chat, that would be fantastic. So there's a little bit of a backgrounder that goes over some of the stuff that you've heard tonight. So just a nice reference there, and it shares a few more details that might be interesting to you. And then if you want to click on that link, and you can click on it right now, it'll come up in your browser, and then it'll just be there, so you won't have to go looking for it again. The survey takes about 10 or 15 minutes. And also, if you would be willing to share that with others that you know, if there's the recording of this session will be up on the website. So if there's others that you think would be interested and would want to know about this and would want to share their ideas, please do share those far and wide. We'd love to hear from as many people as possible in this process. And also encourage yourselves and anyone you know as well to come and join us for the Flood Resilience Challenge game, which will be taking place in 2 weeks on Wednesday evening again. And this is just a fantastic opportunity both to gather together and have some fun ways of interacting with others in the region over something that matters. And as I mentioned before, just truly one of the most powerful and insightful things that we do with people. And it's amazing what people sort of get from coming together in this way and sort of trying on different perspectives on the issues and on what we can do about them in this way. It really opens up people's minds and imaginations to what's possible. So really encourage you to join us for that. And then of course the in-person that we're aiming for at the end of June at Willingdon Park. And that will be where we bring the proposed strategies to you, the draft proposed strategies, and get more of your feedback on the specific pieces that we're going to be recommending. And the survey and tonight, what you've shared with us, all of those pieces are going to help inform us as we come up with some ideas for what the proposed strategies could be to address the types of things we've been talking about today. So those things are incredibly helpful and important. And Bill's asking the most important question of all, which is, are there prizes at game night? Bill, we will get on that. I won't promise anything, but I'm quite sure if you show up, that will come through. So thank you for bringing that up. It's what's games night without prizes, right? So yes, of course.
I think there must be bragging rights too, right?
Oh, for sure. I think we could probably, put the winners on the website. Do you think? And make a big deal about it. Yeah. All right. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us. And Tamsin or Rob, is there anything that I've forgotten that we want to say before we wrap up here? Nope, covered it all. Excellent. All right. Thank you guys very much. Do reach out if there's any questions that you have. Please check the website, as I mentioned, for those links and to find anything that you might need. And we look forward to seeing you again at one of these events coming up, and really hope to hear from you in the survey as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.